Okay, folks, what we're looking at here is how did we get into World War II? It's too simplistic to say that we were minding our own business when in December the Japanese attacked us. That's the end of the story, but that's not the beginning. This is a photograph of President Roosevelt clearly in his wheelchair. This is taken by a family member in one of their family summer homes. This is not how he would portray himself in public. He would not allow himself to be photographed in a wheelchair. This is what Roosevelt says in 1933. In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor. The neighbor who resolutely respects himself, and because he do so, respects the rights of others, i.e., we will stay out of your affairs, you stay out of our affairs. This is known as the good neighbor policy. When Roosevelt issued this, he also removed all the troops from Latin America. All those troops sent down there by his predecessors, going back to Teddy Roosevelt. This is part of that idea of pulling up the drawbridge and creating Fortress America. So this is what happens in 1933. 1933, Roosevelt says goodbye to the world. You are on your own. That's what he says 7 years later. If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. This is known as the Arsenal of Democracy speech. And this says, not only must we engage the world, but we are the only savior of the world. So in 33, it's goodbye world, you're on your own. 7 years later, we must save the world. And that's what we got to figure out what happened. What happened between this, the good neighbor policy, and his Arsenal of Democracy speech? We start in 1933. Secretary of State Cordell Hull viewed the world in terms of moral principles, just like Woodrow Wilson. Well, Congress passed a bill that would force the president to stop arms sales to all belligerents. Why? Because congressional inquiries revealed that American bankers and arms dealers may have led the U.S. to enter World War I. What do you know? Unregulated bankers and arms dealers got us involved in World War I. Maybe we should regulate parts of the economy. Maybe. Charles Warren proposed legislation that would ban arms to belligerents, ban loans to private U.S. banks to foreign governments at war, and prevent U.S. citizens from traveling on belligerent ships. FDR agreed. So Congress passed those three resolutions, known as the Neutrality Act of 1935. FDR felt that without strict neutrality, the U.S. would be involved in another foreign war. Well, that's going to happen really soon. On December 5th, 1935, Italy invades Ethiopia. This is the beginning of Mussolini recreating the Italian Empire. Roosevelt announced an embargo on arms to all belligerents and preventing U.S. citizens from traveling either on Italian or Ethiopian ships. However, petroleum, copper, and scrap iron exports increased to Italy. Those were all fine. So FDR wanted the power to prohibit all war-related materials from exports to belligerents. So Congress updated the 1935 Neutrality Act. In 1936, Adolf Hitler, the democratically elected president of Germany, declares World War I treaties to be void and sent German troops to reoccupy the Rhineland. A couple of years before, I think, 7 years before? Anyhow, it's in the 1920s that the U.S. pulls their troops out of occupying Germany. Secretary of State Hull did not see Hitler's rise to power as necessarily affecting the U.S. What we were focused on was the Spanish Civil War. Spanish-occupied Morocco revolted, and likewise Spanish generals in Spain took up arms against the government. Well, the rebel leader was a general named Francisco Franco, and he arranged for an airlift of military supplies from Germany. The Soviet Union supplied the Spanish government with arms. So what we see going on in the Spanish War is a couple of things. One, The groups that will align themselves with each other for World War II align themselves against each other to support the different sides of the Spanish Civil War. 2, the Neutrality Act did not apply to civil war, only when one country invades another. So, we had all sorts of Americans selling all sorts of war-related material to Spain. For example, Robert Cuse. Robert Cuse was a New Jersey scrap dealer, and he signed a contract to deliver a little over $3 million worth of airplane parts to the Spanish government. Well, then Congress extended the Neutrality Act to cover all civil wars. But then a friend of FDR, a financier and a confidant from New York named Bernard Baruch, came up with this cash and carry idea. Baruch told FDR it wasn't the sale of weapons that got us involved in the World War I, it was the transport of weapons. Because they were carried on American ships, and the American ships got blown up, so here's what we're going to do. Let's sell whatever we want to whoever we want. That's the cash part. And then they carried away on their own ships. 1, we're not loaning money, so we're not going to be tied to this country's success or failure. 2, if this transport ship gets blown up, it's their own ship, not ours. So, that becomes official U.S. policy, cash and carry. Well, German officials react negatively to cash and carry, argue that it resulted in an Anglo-American alliance. The Chinese were also unhappy as they saw the new U.S. policy as benefiting the Japanese. Oh, by the way, Japan invades China. Well, the U.S. replies by sending 1,200 Marines to protect U.S. citizens in China. And you probably don't know this, but an American astronaut, a woman, who will set the record for most time in space at that time by an American astronaut, was a little girl in China. Her parents were Christian missionaries. And her parents and other Americans are going to be captured by the Japanese and will spend the war as prisoners of war. This little girl, after the war, will come home with her parents to Oklahoma, where she will go to college and get a degree in engineering and get her pilot's license and become one of the first women brought in by NASA to be astronauts. And her name is what? Anybody know? She happened to be the first babysitter for our son. The first time that my wife and I went out, she watched him. She lives right around the corner from us, although that's probably not a hint. You're not sure what neighborhood I live in. Oh well, we'll talk about her later on when we talk about the Space Shuttle program. So anyhow, FDR in 1936 gives his quarantine speech, which implied that collective action against aggression without stating what that action would be. So, we're not going to necessarily invade another country. We're going to quarantine it. We're going to surround it with fellow troops. Well, 37, Sumner Welles, U.S. Undersecretary of State, tells FDR that unless the U.S. takes a leading role in international affairs, the world will soon be engulfed in war. Welles proposed a meeting of the world's leaders to be held in Washington, D.C. to discuss disarmament. Most declined. Woodrow Wilson was dead. Winston Churchill called Great Britain's refusal to join this conference, quote, the loss of the last frail chance to save the world from tyranny, otherwise by war. In 1936, Germany starts to reclaim the territories that the treaties of World War I removed from Germany. They form an alliance with Austria, known as the Anschluss. And U.S. accepts Hitler's plan by elevating the U.S. diplomatic legation in Vienna to a full consulate. Well, FDR asked Hitler, Neville Chamberlain, the leader of Great Britain, and other world leaders to meet in Washington, D.C. to talk about a peaceful settlement of Europe. Well, they all told FDR, no, if you want to have a meeting, you come to Europe. Well, FDR said, no, I'm busy, but the Europeans met. It's called the Munich Conference. England agrees to allow Germany to occupy the territory in Europe that had been traditionally German before World War I, in exchange for a promise by Hitler that Germany will not seek additional non-German land. Yay! And Hitler says, okay, I won't take any non-German land. FDR cables Hitler, telling him the U.S. will not involve itself with European affairs. That's troubling, because this cable, this message from FDR to Hitler, is telling Hitler, we are going to stay out of European affairs. In other words, the U.S. is one country. Germany does not have to worry about if they say, for the heck of it, they invade Poland on September 1st, 1939. Well, according to one historian, a man named Robert Devine, FDR's letter to Hitler was, quote, a green light to the German dictator to continue pressing Britain and France for Czechoslovakia. Well, just for the heck of it, FDR asked Congress for $300 million to shore up the national defense. March 15, 1939, German troops take Czechoslovakia. Senators start calling to rescind the Neutrality Act and place all belligerents on the cash and carry policy while guaranteeing aid to England and France. On September 1, 1939, Germany invades Poland. World War II now becomes a reality. September 21, FDR asked the House to repeal the arms embargo, i.e. so we can start sending weapons to England and France. That's passed in both the House and the Senate. FDR immediately proclaims the North Atlantic, quote, a combat zone, which prohibits American ships from entering. And he begins selling arms to England and France. Ex-President Herbert Hoover heads the Finnish Relief Fund. Finland was one of the countries that Germany invaded, and he raises $60 million to loan to the Finnish government in exile. If FDR begins to publicly ridicule the policy of isolation when he said, quote, overwhelmingly, we as a nation are convinced that military and naval victory for the gods of force and hate would endanger the institutions of democracy in the Western world, and that equally, therefore, the whole of our sympathies lie with those nations that are giving their blood in combat against those forces. A long, fancy way of saying, we may need to get involved. In 1940, FDR asked Congress to appropriate an additional $2 billion for national defense. Germany takes Belgium and Holland. FDR asked Congress for an additional $1 billion. Congress gives him $3.5 billion, and then he asks for more. July 10th, FDR asked for $10 billion in military appropriations. Thus, the total defense budget for 1940, $10.5 billion. We are not at war. Well, not officially. We are preparing for war. We're thinking about it. $10.5 billion just in 1940. The changing American attitude for war in Europe is evidenced in the formation of something called the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, the CDAAA. This is also somewhat of an isolationist group. We're not really going to get involved in war by sending combat troops, but we are going to send absolutely everything that England and France needs to put an end to German aggression. Well, what England needs are military ships. So, we have something called the Destroyers for Bases policy. We're going to send our excess destroyers, our warships, to England, and in exchange, England is going to give us some bases, like we're going to get the Virgin Islands. Nice place to vacation, not really a major military destination. Secretary of State Secretary of State Hull tells FDR, we've got to be careful about cutting off aid to Japan in their war against the Chinese, because that could provoke the Japanese to attack the U.S. September 11th, 1940, FDR said, "I hate war now more than ever. I have one supreme determination, to do all that I can to keep war away from these shores for all time." 2 months later, FDR says he will not allow U.S. troops to be sent to, quote, "any foreign wars." That's the phrase he uses, any foreign wars. But if the U.S. is attacked, it ain't a foreign war. So is that what he's suggesting? He's suggesting that the U.S. is going to stay out of this war, which is now both in Europe and Asia, until we're attacked. Well, there's more talk about cutting off the Japanese. FDR in December of 40 says that England is America's first line of defense. And so we come up with a new plan called Lend-Lease. He uses the garden hose analogy. When your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't charge him to use your hose to put out the fire. You give it to him, and when he's done putting out the fire, he will return the hose to you. That's what we need to do. We need to give, temporarily lend, anything and everything the Allies need to defeat Germany. And when they're done, they'll give it back to us. And that's when he gives his arsenal of democracy speech. And Congress passes the Lend-Lease bill, which is known as H.R. 1776. Please note the symbolic number to this House resolution. Well, House Resolution 1776 appropriates $7 billion in aid to go to Britain and France. U.S. and British military leaders coordinate potential joint military activities against Germany in 1941. In February, FDR announces the U.S. Navy would begin escorting British ships from U.S. to England. And sometimes those ships may be fired on. March 27th, FDR announces Plan ABC-1 to make the joint U.S.-Great Britain military preparation talks official policy. April 1st, FDR announced the U.S. Navy would be able to take, quote, aggressive actions if the Germans go after the U.S. in the Atlantic. It's called the Hemisphere Defense Plan Number 1. So, we're not officially at war, and this is April, but the Navy is allowed to take offensive actions against Germany. April 9th, Danish government in exile places Greenland under the U.S. protection and authorizes the U.S. to construct military bases on the island, which we do. We are now a hell of a lot closer, physically, to the war. In April, FDR announces the existence of, quote, an unlimited national emergency. And we loan $100 million to China in their fight against the Japanese. Japan is still allowed to purchase fuel from the U.S. Well, Japanese admirals are concerned about the anti-Japanese rhetoric in Congress, so some Japanese admirals asked to meet with Secretary of State Paul in D.C. These Japanese also asked the U.S. to stop aiding China. And the Japanese said, if you stop aiding China, Japan would consider withdrawing from China. The U.S. says no. Instead, the U.S. freezes all Japanese funds in the U.S. Secretary of Interior Harold Ickes calls for a complete embargo of everything to Japan. July 10th, Wells tells the Japanese if they continue to make more territory in Asia, then the U.S. would, quote, impose various embargoes, both economic and financial. July 11th, FDR announced that U.S. ships would begin escorting Iceland-flagged ships between the U.S. and Iceland. An attack on any of these ships would necessarily be an attack on the U.S. and thus an act of war. July 25th, FDR announced the U.S. would stop all trade with Japan, but not oil. Joseph Guru, U.S. ambassador to Japan, told FDR, the obvious conclusion of this is, quote, inevitable war. The U.S. announces $40 million in aid to Russia. Look at that. $100 million to China fighting the Japanese. Billions, right, to England and France. And of that $40 million aid appropriated for Russia, only $7 million actually makes it to Russia by the end of 1941. In the summer,